Welcome the anointed ones. When a system built on secrets pauses, rechecks its math, and quietly adds another seal to the file, it's not curiosity, it's caution. Most people think investigations start when something goes wrong. That's a comforting lie. In reality, some files are opened because nothing went wrong when it absolutely should have. Pressure was applied. Time passed. Opportunities to slip were everywhere, yet the record stayed clean, not polished, not staged. Clean in a way that feels inconvenient to people whose job depends on finding leverage. Here's a fact that rarely gets said out loud. Large intelligence agencies don't escalate oversight because someone is loud or rebellious. They do it when influence shows up without a visible supply chain. When outcomes shift, people realign or situations de-escalate around one individual, and there's no money trail, no communication trail, no behavioral drift. That's when a routine review quietly becomes something else. No flashing lights, no dramatic entrances, just a second set of eyes, then a third, then a seal that wasn't there before. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. And a little funny, if we're being honest. You didn't do anything cinematic. No shadow meetings, no burner phones, no mysterious late-night disappearances. You lived your life, handled your business, stayed within the lines, and somehow still made an impact that couldn't be explained by normal cause and effect. Imagine running every diagnostic and discovering the problem isn't the system. It's that the system can't find a flaw. That's not a relief. That's a headache with paperwork. So when page 3 carries a mark that doesn't belong to ordinary stories, it isn't about paranoia or ego. It's about a quiet acknowledgement. This subject doesn't move the way others do. They don't bend under stress, they don't trade values for comfort, and they don't leave the kind of mess investigators are trained to clean up. That's not exciting. That's inconvenient. And in worlds built on control, inconvenience gets documented very carefully. Stay with me, because what they found, or didn't find, changes everything that comes next. Number 1. Your file wasn't opened to find dirt, it was opened to understand why nothing stuck. Most investigations begin with an assumption. Somewhere in the pressure, you slipped. People usually do. Time exposes shortcuts, stress reveals habits, and opportunity leaves fingerprints. So when a file is reopened, it's rarely about suspicion at first, it's about expectation. The expectation that if they look long enough, something will finally show up. A bad decision, a quiet compromise, a moment where survival mattered more than principle. That's what they went looking for. Instead, they found a pattern that didn't match the environment you were placed in. You were under pressure long enough for cracks to form, yet none did. That's unsettling because systems rely on averages. They rely on predictable reactions to stress. Most people bend, some break, others trade pieces of themselves just to make the heat stop. You didn't. Not loudly, not secretly, not over time. What made the file interesting wasn't perfection. It was absence. No escalation in behavior, no shift in values, no sudden changes when no one was watching. You reacted the same way in private as you did in public. That consistency is rare because it requires internal rules that don't depend on reward or punishment. You didn't behave well because someone might notice. You behaved the same because that's how you operate. They expected residue. Stress usually leaves residue. People vent in the wrong places, trust the wrong person, cut corners when fatigue sets in. You stayed steady. Not passive, not frozen, steady. That tells them something deeper than innocence. It tells them your decisions aren't situational, they're structural. So the file wasn't opened to accuse you, it was reopened to study you. To understand how someone can move through prolonged pressure without becoming sloppy, resentful, or reactive. Clean didn't mean untouched, it meant uncorrupted, and that difference matters. When nothing sticks, it forces a different kind of attention, not hostile, not admiring, analytical, because a clean record under stress isn't luck, It's discipline that didn't need supervision. And that's the kind of detail systems don't know what to do with, but never ignore. Number 2. The CIA seal appears when influence can't be traced through normal channels. In intelligence work, control is everything. Every move, every shift in circumstance, every unexpected outcome is usually tied to a chain of influence that can be mapped. Money, communication, pressure, manipulation, they leave traces. That's how systems predict behavior, anticipate risk, and neutralize threats. But when outcomes shift around one person and no traceable force exists, the anomaly itself becomes the focus. That's when a seal appears. Not because you're dangerous in the way they imagine, but because your influence is untraceable. The CIA seal on page 3 isn't a warning of criminality, it's a flag of unpredictability. It's their way of saying, this subject operates outside the expected flow. People and situations bend around you without the usual levers being applied. Decisions change, conflicts de-escalate, conversations shift, and people respond differently. But there's no apparent trigger, no email, no instruction, no hidden agenda. That kind of influence is a nightmare for anyone whose job depends on control, because it doesn't follow the rules. This seal signals that you affect outcomes without creating a footprint. It's like seeing a chessboard reset itself after every move. You are moving pieces without leaving fingerprints, changing patterns without leaving traces, and somehow the environment adapts quietly to your presence. That's why intelligence agencies take notice. It's subtle, almost invisible, but profoundly disruptive to systems designed to map cause and effect. The unsettling truth is that influence like this can't be trained or faked. It can't be bought or coerced. Either it exists naturally or it doesn't. It comes from a combination of clarity, consistency, and presence that forces alignment without direction. That's what makes it stand out. So when the CIA seal appears in your file, it isn't about punishment. It's about recognition that here is a variable they can't control, a presence that bends the environment without conventional tools. And for the observers, that's far more disorienting than anything they could manufacture, because it proves that not everything can be predicted, manipulated, or owned. Number 3, clean doesn't mean passive, it means incorruptible under prolonged stress. People love to confuse calm with weakness. They assume if someone isn't loud, reactive, or constantly proving something, then nothing is happening inside them. But that misunderstanding disappears the moment real pressure shows up. Long pressure, the kind that doesn't scream, but waits. The kind that stretches over years, not days. That's when the difference becomes obvious. Being clean in that environment doesn't mean you avoided conflict or stayed on the sidelines. It means you were exposed to enough stress to justify bad choices and still didn't make them. You had reasons. You had excuses that would have made sense to anyone watching from the outside. Fatigue alone gives most people permission to cut corners. You didn't take it. Prolonged stress usually reshapes people. It hardens them, cheapens their values, or slowly teaches them to trade integrity for relief. That's the quiet corruption no one talks about. Not dramatic betrayal, just small, repeated compromises that feel practical at the time. You resisted that erosion, not once, but over and over again. That's what incorruptible actually looks like. You didn't become reckless to feel powerful, and you didn't become compliant to feel safe. You stayed operational, clear, measured. You learned how to function without bleeding your principles all over the place. That's not passivity, that's control. What makes this uncomfortable for observers is that your restraint wasn't fear-based. You weren't frozen, you weren't avoiding risk. You simply refused to let stress decide who you would become. That's rare because stress is persuasive. It tells people they deserve an exception. You didn't listen. So when they call the file clean, they aren't saying you were untouched. They're acknowledging that despite sustained pressure, you didn't absorb the corruption around you. You didn't mirror it. You didn't internalize it. You didn't let it rewrite your internal rules. That kind of cleanliness isn't innocence. It's strength that doesn't announce itself. It's discipline that doesn't need witnesses. And under prolonged stress, that's not accidental. It's a choice made repeatedly, quietly, and without applause. Number 4. Surveillance escalates when character stays consistent across environments. Most people think being watched is about fear, paranoia, or mistakes. In reality, surveillance intensifies when someone behaves exactly the same, no matter where they are or who's around. Systems built to monitor human behavior depend on variability. They expect people to crack, bend, or adapt when the context changes. Offices, homes, public spaces, private rooms, behavior should shift under observation. It almost always does, but when it doesn't, that's when the alarms go off. Consistency under observation is quietly terrifying to anyone trying to map or predict outcomes. You don't need to be flashy, loud, or aggressive. You just need to operate with the same internal code whether someone is taking notes in the corner or not. That's what makes people untraceable, unexploitable, and frustratingly hard to categorize. The minute someone notices that your reactions don't vary, even under different pressures or audiences, the file gets more attention. Not because you're guilty, but because consistency challenges everything they think they know about influence and control. It's not about perfection, it's about predictability, or rather, the lack of it. Most systems rely on patterns that can be bent through stress, incentives, or intimidation. When a person remains steady, those patterns break. Their models fail. And the system's first response isn't to congratulate you, it's to investigate. They want to understand how someone could remain untouchable, how outcomes bend around a human presence without leaving traces or cracks. Consistency under pressure isn't taught. It's earned, often painfully, through choices that test principle against convenience. People who operate this way don't need approval, they don't chase validation, and they don't fracture for comfort. That rare alignment of values and action is invisible on a resume but glaring on a surveillance report. The more someone observes, and the less variance they find, the more scrutiny the person attracts. Because in worlds built on human error, anyone who behaves identically across environments isn't just unusual, they're a variable the system cannot predict, manipulate, or dismiss. That's why files like yours get opened, reopened, and stamped with more than just administrative notes. It's a system's way of documenting someone it can't explain. Number 5. They weren't looking for crimes. They were mapping thresholds. Most of the time, files aren't opened because someone is suspected of wrongdoing. Agencies like the FBI or CIA are trained to study patterns, behaviors, and responses long before anything illegal happens. They're looking for boundaries, how far a person will go before bending, breaking, or compromising themselves. They want to know what pressure looks like on you, how long it takes to crack, what situations make you flinch, and where your patience or principles fail. It's not judgment, it's measurement. They expect small fractures to appear under stress, like tiny cracks in a supposedly strong structure. Everyone has them. Everyone reaches a limit eventually. That's how they predict reactions and control outcomes. But you didn't. You faced situations designed to test compliance, endurance, and loyalty. You navigated manipulation, oversight, and pressure without letting your internal rules shift, bend, or collapse. That's exactly the opposite of what they anticipated, and it throws their entire mapping system into question. Threshold mapping is subtle. It doesn't leave evidence in court, in reports, or in the obvious record of life. It's watching how you respond when no one expects you to respond, seeing whether desperation leads to compromise, whether fear forces a shortcut, whether convenience replaces integrity. Your file wasn't opened because they believed you did something wrong. They opened it because their expectations didn't match reality. You defied the patterns they rely on, and that requires explanation. The unnerving truth is that thresholds aren't measured once, they're observed over time. Repeated stress, repeated choices, repeated opportunities to fail. And every single time, you held your line. That's what makes someone fascinating to a system built to predict failure. The more consistent your integrity under pressure, the more the observers take note. So your clean record isn't a sign of inactivity. It's a sign of endurance. Your file isn't just a file. It's a timeline of tests passed, a map of thresholds they couldn't cross, and a silent admission that some people simply can't be measured the way the system expects. It's inconvenient, unnerving, and impossible to ignore. Number 6. The seal marks a subject who can't be controlled through fear or reward. Most systems, governmental, corporate, or otherwise, operate on a simple principle. People respond to incentives or threats. If you want compliance, you offer reward. If you want restraint, you apply fear. It's predictable. Almost everyone bends, shifts, or compromises when the right lever is pulled. But your file tells a different story. The seal doesn't appear because someone was dangerous in the usual sense. It appears because the usual tools didn't work. Fear didn't move you. Reward didn't sway you. That combination is rare enough to trigger curiosity, concern, and a close second look. People who can't be influenced by fear aren't necessarily brave. Bravery is loud and visible, and it can be misread. What observers notice in your file is subtle. You don't react impulsively to intimidation, pressure, or threats of consequence. You stay grounded, deliberate, and consistent. Systems built to control rely on overreaction. They expect panic, hesitation, or compromise. When none of those appear, the subject becomes a variable they can't easily predict or manipulate. Similarly, most people can be persuaded by reward, whether recognition, money, status, or approval. But your consistency wasn't conditional on what you could gain. You weren't transactional in your decision-making. You didn't trade principle for comfort. That independence is profoundly unsettling to organizations trained to rely on influence, because it breaks a key assumption that every individual has a price, even if it's intangible. The combination of immunity to both fear and reward is why the seal matters. It's not a badge of danger, it's a note of exception. The observers recognize that here is a person who moves through life without predictable levers, whose choices can't be directed through conventional tactics, and whose integrity resists standard manipulation. That makes you fascinating, unexplainable, and ultimately uncontainable within ordinary protocols. The seal is their acknowledgement. Conventional control won't work here. You operate outside their templates, and that single truth makes every other observation about you more urgent, more scrutinized, and more impossible to ignore. It's the mark of someone whose impact exists without leaving traces that can be forced, bought, or intimidated. Number 7. Your past didn't reveal secrets, it revealed restraint. Most people's histories are a roadmap of impulses, mistakes, and compromises. Observers expect that pressure, opportunity, and circumstance leave traces, evidence of hidden motives, missteps, or shortcuts taken. But your past doesn't read that way. Instead of exposing flaws, it demonstrates discipline. It shows a pattern of restraint so consistent that it defies the usual narrative of human behavior. That's what makes a clean file remarkable. It isn't empty, it's deliberate. Every choice, every interaction, every decision over time points to someone who understands limits and respects them. Not because someone else is watching, but because you enforce your own boundaries. Restraint doesn't show up as grand gestures or heroic acts. It shows up quietly. It's in the moments where most people would react, retaliate, or seize an advantage. But you paused. You measured. You stayed within principles even when no one else cared. That's what makes your file unnerving to those trained to analyze behavior. They expect deviations. They expect lapses. They expect impulsive decisions. They find none. Instead, they see a person whose influence was exerted without leaving evidence of compromise, whose power comes from discipline rather than manipulation. What's unnerving for systems that track human behavior is that restraint is a variable they can't control. You can't train it in someone else. You can't replicate it with incentives. It either exists internally or it doesn't. And because you consistently operated from that place, every observer is forced to acknowledge that influence and impact can exist without conventional traces, without shortcuts, without leverage, and without bending ethical lines. Your past didn't hide secrets because there were none to exploit. It highlighted the rare ability to navigate pressure, scrutiny, and temptation with integrity intact. That kind of record isn't just unusual. It's destabilizing for systems built to predict behavior through error. What they see isn't perfection. They see a human being who cannot be mapped in the usual way, whose restraint is itself a form of power, and whose life quietly defies the assumptions under which most people are monitored, judged, or controlled. Number 8. Clean files scare systems built on compromise economies. Most organizations, whether in intelligence, corporate structures, or bureaucracies, operate on an unspoken assumption. Everyone has a price, a weakness, or a shadow. It's how influence moves through systems. Control is exercised by exploiting the cracks, nudging behavior, or leveraging hidden faults. That's the economy of compromise, where people's errors, fears, and desires are currency. But a clean file doesn't fit that model. It disrupts it entirely, and that's why it triggers concern instead of relief. A clean file isn't just a record without mistakes. It's a record without leverage. Observers expect to find hooks, patterns, or inconsistencies that can be exploited. When they don't, the system itself becomes unstable. Suddenly, their standard approach to prediction, manipulation, and oversight doesn't apply. They can't buy influence. They can't threaten it. They can't bargain or maneuver in the usual way. A clean record is a refusal to participate in the invisible economy of compromise, and that refusal makes systems nervous because it challenges the very logic they rely on. It's not about perfection or invisibility. It's about unexploitable integrity. People with clean files don't react predictably to pressure or opportunity. They respond according to their own internal rules, rules that can't be purchased or coerced. That makes them anomalies, and anomalies demand explanation, analysis, and sometimes scrutiny beyond what is necessary for ordinary oversight. The unnerving reality for any system built on compromise is that someone who refuses to engage in it cannot be contained, predicted, or fully understood. They exist outside the flow of leverage. Their actions ripple without leaving an exploitable trail. Influence flows around them instead of through them. That creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is uncomfortable in any environment designed for control. A clean file, then, isn't a quiet achievement. It's a disruption. It's proof that integrity, discipline, and consistency can exist in ways the system cannot measure or control. And that makes you both invisible in one sense and impossible to ignore in another, because your existence quietly undermines assumptions that most institutions depend on to function. Number 9. They found no alliances because you weren't moved by group approval. Most people operate within invisible networks, consciously or unconsciously seeking validation from peers, superiors, or crowds. Alliances form, loyalties shift, and decisions are often influenced by how others perceive us. That's predictable. That's manageable. That's how systems anticipate behavior. But your file shows something different. There were no patterns of dependency, no clusters of influence, no traceable alignment with groups or factions. You didn't need approval, and that's what makes you stand out and quietly unsettle those watching. Not needing validation doesn't mean isolation or arrogance. It means independence. It means that while everyone else is negotiating for approval, you make decisions according to internal rules, values, and priorities. Your choices aren't shaped by applause, fear of judgment, or the push and pull of social dynamics. That independence is inherently disruptive to systems that rely on predictability, because people who are tethered to networks are easier to manipulate, anticipate, and categorize. You weren't tethered. You were a variable outside the norm. Because you didn't seek alliances, there were no manipulable connections. There were no links that could be leveraged, no hidden leverage points waiting to be exploited. That's unnerving to anyone analyzing behavior, because it removes the conventional levers of influence. They couldn't pressure you through peers, reward you through status, or isolate you through exclusion. There was no social equation to solve. You moved through environments in a way that left no predictable pattern for observers to exploit. The absence of alliances also signals strength in restraint. You didn't need to curry favor or position yourself strategically within groups to survive or succeed. Your trajectory was defined by clarity of purpose, self-reliance, and unshakable principles. That makes you harder to measure, harder to predict, and ultimately, harder to control. In a world that assumes human behavior is relational, that decisions are social, your independence becomes a form of invisible influence. It doesn't scream for attention, but it ripples through systems quietly, leaving observers both intrigued and unsettled. Your file doesn't just record activity, it documents the rare ability to operate untethered, unaffected, and strategically unaligned. Number 10. Page 3 mattered because page 1 and 2 were too ordinary. When files are reviewed, the first pages usually tell a simple story. They cover background, basic history, education, work, relationships, everything predictable, understandable, explainable. Most people are measured by what appears there: patterns of behavior, small mistakes, opportunities for leverage. In your case, pages 1 and 2 were exactly that. Ordinary. Nothing to raise alarms, nothing to provoke interest beyond routine documentation. That should have ended the story, but it didn't. Page 3 changes everything, because it carries the anomaly, the part of the record that defies expectation. The ordinary early pages serve a purpose. They lull observers into assuming they understand the subject. They create the illusion that standard models of analysis will apply. And that's exactly what page 3 shatters. Suddenly, the predictable stops. Ordinary records are no longer enough to explain influence, consistency, and presence. Page 3 is the point where systems pause because it introduces a variable that cannot be easily categorized, traced, or explained by conventional means. It's subtle, almost invisible on the surface, but profound in impact. This is where clean becomes unsettling. Page 3 reveals not a flaw, not a scandal, not a secret, but an effect without cause. Influence exists, decisions shift, outcomes change, all without traceable leverage or visible interference. That's what draws attention. That's why the seal appears. The first 2 pages are ordinary because they follow the rules. Page 3 is extraordinary because it shows the rule-breaking force of someone who operates independently of expectation without leaving fingerprints, yet still shaping circumstances. What makes this so compelling and dangerous to systems built on predictability is that it forces observers to acknowledge a reality they can't control. Page 3 doesn't shout. It doesn't justify fear or admiration. It quietly proves that presence, discipline, and integrity can generate measurable effect without conventional tools, networks, or manipulation. That's why page 3 matters. It's not about history, it's about the unpredictable way influence manifests in someone who refuses to fit the template. It's a record of exception, a signal to every system that studies behavior. Here is a human being who cannot be reduced to normal patterns, and that changes everything. Number 11. You didn't evade monitoring, you outgrew its relevance. Most people believe staying under scrutiny means hiding, dodging, or being clever. They think control is about avoiding detection. But that's a shallow view. What your file reveals is different. You didn't need to escape monitoring because the system observing you became irrelevant to the way you operate. It's not invisibility, it's independence. You moved through environments, decisions, and pressures without leaving exploitable evidence. The observers could watch, take notes, even anticipate scenarios, but none of it mattered, because the variables that actually defined your actions weren't theirs to influence. This is where oversight meets its limits. Surveillance works by measuring reaction, finding patterns, and identifying pressure points. It assumes that human behavior can be predicted when observed closely enough. But someone who operates with clarity, consistency, and internal discipline under pressure isn't reacting. They're acting from an unshakable center. The more they watch, the less meaningful their observations become, because their maps of control no longer align with reality. You aren't slipping through gaps. You are simply operating outside the framework the system uses to define control. It's not about defiance or secrecy. You didn't stage actions to mislead. You weren't evasive or cautious in the obvious sense. You simply acted according to internal rules that were stronger than external oversight. That makes every effort to contain, predict, or influence you increasingly redundant. Observers realize that traditional tools, fear, reward, surveillance, are insufficient to change outcomes when someone's integrity and decision-making are self-contained. That's why your file stands out. It's clean, but not empty. It records movement without vulnerability, presence without trace, and influence without leverage. Monitoring didn't fail because it wasn't thorough. It failed because it was irrelevant to the way you exist in the world. Systems can study you, try to map you, even escalate scrutiny, but none of it can force deviation where none exists. Outgrowing relevance is a quiet form of power, and it's unsettling because it demonstrates that oversight is only as strong as the variables it can affect, and you by design are beyond that reach. Number 12. Clean doesn't mean unseen, it means unexploitable. Most people assume a clean record means you've managed to fly under the radar, that your actions weren't noticed, and that your life hasn't left a mark on anyone. That's a shallow understanding. In reality, a clean file isn't about invisibility. It's about being untouchable in ways that matter. Observers saw everything. Your decisions, your interactions, your influence. What they didn't find was anything they could use against you. That distinction is what makes a clean file so disruptive to systems designed to manipulate and predict human behavior. Being unexploitable doesn't mean perfect. It doesn't mean a flawless life free of mistakes or challenges. It means that under scrutiny, pressure, and temptation, you didn't produce vulnerabilities they could leverage. No inconsistency, no lapse in judgment, no compromise of principle. Everything they documented, analyzed, and revisited showed someone who could be observed endlessly and still remain fundamentally intact. That's unsettling because most systems assume everyone has a breaking point, a weakness, or a shadow. When they don't find one, the assumptions themselves become unstable. Unexploitable is also quiet power. It doesn't need alarms or warning signs. Influence still occurs, impact still spreads, but it happens without leaving trails that others can control, manipulate, or weaponize. Systems built on control and prediction don't know how to respond to that because they rely on the predictability of human flaw. They can't assign cause, they can't anticipate action, and they can't insert leverage where none exists. Your file demonstrates a rare equilibrium, observed but untouchable, present but uncontrollable, influential but untraceable. That's what makes it remarkable and unnerving at the same time. Clean is not a passive state, it's active mastery. It's the ability to navigate life under constant observation and pressure without producing compromise, scandal, or weakness. And for anyone trained to exploit human behavior, that mastery is far more dangerous than any visible transgression because it cannot be controlled, coerced, or broken. Number 13. The SEAL isn't about rank, it's about risk assessment. Most people assume that a CIA or FBI seal on a file signals status, authority, or notoriety. That's the surface-level interpretation, and it misses the real reason the seal exists. It's not a badge of power, it's a signal of unpredictability. It marks someone whose actions can't be reliably predicted, steered, or influenced, and that makes them a variable that needs constant assessment. Rank can be earned, titles can be assigned, but risk is measured, calculated, and monitored. That's what the SEAL represents. A subject who defies conventional modeling and forces observers to pause. Risk assessment in this context isn't about criminality. It's about control. Agencies rely on assumptions that human behavior can be guided through pressure, reward, networks, or fear. Most people can be nudged, manipulated, or pushed toward an outcome that suits someone else's design. When a person refuses to bend, when influence leaves no trace and outcomes shift without visible cause, that triggers scrutiny. The SEAL is the system's way of saying, this individual cannot be ignored, cannot be contained, and must be monitored differently. It's unsettling because the SEAL highlights a kind of power that isn't obvious. It doesn't come from connections, coercion, or aggression. It comes from integrity, consistency, and untraceable influence. Every choice you make under observation leaves no exploitable mark, yet circumstances align with your presence. That's a risk to anyone whose job relies on predicting patterns, because the existence of someone who operates outside those patterns exposes the limitations of the entire system. The SEAL also communicates a kind of respect disguised as caution. It acknowledges that the subject is operating at a level beyond ordinary leverage. They are a human variable that must be observed continuously, not because they are dangerous in a conventional sense, but because their consistency, discipline, and autonomy make them fundamentally unmanageable. Ultimately, the SEAL isn't about what you have done. It's about what you represent. A person who can't be broken, coerced, or controlled. And for systems built on predictability, that's the kind of risk that demands attention, documentation, and silent acknowledgement, page after page, file after file. Number 14. When oversight closes your file quietly, it's because you passed without knowing the test existed. Most people assume that files are closed because the story is over, because the subject has been judged, categorized, or cleared in the usual way. That's rarely the case. In reality, a file closes quietly when scrutiny realizes it has nothing left to extract. Observers expected reactions, failures, compromises, moments of weakness, but they didn't find any. That's why the closure is quiet. No fanfare, no explanation, no celebration. It's a system acknowledging a fact that doesn't fit the narrative it was trained to expect. You succeeded under observation without ever bending, breaking, or betraying your principles. Passing a test you didn't even know existed is the ultimate form of untraceable influence. While others might struggle to perform under scrutiny because they feel pressure, fear, or the need to impress, you navigated the same conditions naturally. You weren't calculating, defensive, or performative. You were simply operating according to your internal code. That's why oversight becomes irrelevant the moment it realizes the subject cannot be manipulated, predicted, or exploited. The test wasn't something you prepared for. It was just the pressure of life, amplified by constant observation, and you passed anyway. The quiet closure also speaks volumes about resilience and integrity. Systems built to map behavior are trained to expect error, compromise, and human flaw. When none appear, it forces acknowledgement without words. Your record becomes proof that discipline, consistency, and unshakable principles are not just ideals. They are operational tools that leave real, measurable impact without producing vulnerabilities. This kind of outcome is unsettling for observers because it defies their models. It's not that you broke the rules. They were irrelevant to you. It's not that you avoided scrutiny. You outgrew its purpose. The system records you as an anomaly, someone who operated above and beyond expectations, someone whose life under observation is a case study in unexploitable mastery. When your file closes quietly, it isn't a conclusion. It's recognition. Recognition that influence, power, and integrity can exist without drama, manipulation, or compromise. It's proof that some people succeed on principles alone, and when that happens, the system has no choice but to step back, document, and acknowledge without comment. When the FBI opens your file expecting evidence, leverage, or a breaking point, and instead finds discipline, consistency, and influence without compromise, it changes everything. This isn't about luck, coincidence, or some invisible shield protecting you. It's about mastery. Mastery of self, mastery of circumstance, and mastery of pressure. Every page of that file tells a story, not of crime or scandal, but of unshakable principles, quiet restraint, and influence that moves without leaving footprints. The CIA seal, the scrutiny, the attention, they aren't there to punish. They are there to acknowledge something rare, something systems built to predict and control human behavior struggle to comprehend, a human being who cannot be bent, bought, or broken. From page 1 to the quiet closure, the record illustrates a single truth. Clean doesn't mean passive, it means incorruptible. It means unexploitable. It means operating above expectation, above the tools of manipulation and fear, and doing it without anyone noticing, without fanfare, and without ever needing permission. You weren't observed and found wanting. You were observed and found exceptional. You weren't tested and found ordinary. You were tested and passed without ever knowing the test existed. That's the level of power, influence, and clarity that makes systems pause, rethink, and document carefully, because it proves that real authority doesn't shout, it doesn't manipulate, and it doesn't leave weakness behind. This is more than a file. It's a statement to anyone who believes influence must follow rules, control must leave marks, and power is measured by visibility. You exist as proof that integrity, consistency, and quiet mastery are forces that change outcomes without needing recognition. You are a living exception, a variable that cannot be controlled, and a reality that systems must respect, even if silently. If this resonates with you, if it hits deeper than anything you've seen before, make sure you don't just watch and move on. Hit that subscribe button, like this video, comment below with your thoughts, and share it with someone who needs to see this. This knowledge deserves to travel, and the more people understand it, the more they realize that real power isn't seen. It's earned, demonstrated, and quietly unshakable. Don't just watch. Be part of this movement. God bless you.